When Jess suggested we camp near Wolf Creek Crater, I hesitated. Everyone had heard the stories, the notorious murders in the early 2000s that put this remote stretch in the Kimberley on the map for all the wrong reasons. Mick Taylor, the serial killer immortalized in a film, had stalked travelers here. Though the movie exaggerated details, the real-life events were terrifying enough. Young people disappearing without a trace, their fates revealed only by scattered belongings and chilling witness accounts. Jess shrugged off my unease. That was years ago. It's just a crater now, nothing else. Besides, the stargazing there is incredible. I should have trusted my instincts. We arrived in the late afternoon. Me, Jess, Ethan, Sarah, and Mark. The crater was as eerie as it was beautiful. A massive gouge in the earth surrounded by endless, barren bushland. The air hung heavy with the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath. "This place is spooky," Sarah murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the charm," Jess said, snapping photos. "Embrace it." We set up camp on a flat patch of land just a short hike from the crater's edge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Outback transformed into an ocean of darkness. The stars were breathtaking, but the vast, open emptiness around us was suffocating. We lit a fire and tried to lighten the mood with jokes and stories, but the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing hour. It started just after midnight. A whistle, not the kind made by wind, but deliberate, a single high-pitched note that cut through the stillness. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, clutching her jacket. "Probably just the wind," Ethan said, though his voice betrayed him. There was no wind. The whistle came again, this time closer, followed by a faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. "Okay, not funny," Jess said, standing up and shining her flashlight towards the sound. The beam landed on nothing but bushes and scrub. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves it was an animal or our imaginations, but then came the laugh, a deep, guttural chuckle that seemed to echo all around us. Mark stood, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello? Who's out there?" No answer, just another crunch of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, circling the camp. We huddled closer to the fire, its flickering light casting long, jagged shadows. Every sound made me jump. Every whisper of the night felt like it was closing in on us, then Jess screamed. Her flashlight had caught something, a figure half hidden behind a tree. He didn't flinch at the light, but stepped out, fully into view. He was tall and wiry, his face gaunt and leathery, as if it had been baked by the sun for decades. His eyes were what froze me. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with something that was neither curiosity nor malice, but the kind of cold calculation that made my stomach churn. "Hey," Mark shouted, brandishing a stick from the fire. "What do you want?" The man didn't answer. He just tilted his head, studying us like we were animals in a cage. Then we saw the others. Two more figures emerged from the darkness, standing at the edge of the firelight. One was clutching a rusted axe, the other dragging a length of chain that scraped against the ground. Faces were slack, emotionless, as if they'd done this before and knew exactly how it would play out. "Get in the car!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah by the arms. We bolted, our gear forgotten. Mark swung the fiery stick wildly as he backed towards the vehicle, keeping the figures at bay. Jess fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling as the others began to move, slow and deliberate, their footsteps crunching on the dry ground. "Jess, hurry!" Ethan shouted. The car roared to life and we piled in, slamming the doors just as one of the men reached out, his dirty, calloused hand smearing the window. As we sped off, the headlights illuminated their faces one last time. They weren't shouting or chasing us, they just stood there, watching, the faintest hint of smiles tugging at their cracked lips. We didn't stop until we reached a roadhouse hours later. The police listened to our story, their faces growing grim. "This isn't the first report we've had out there," one officer said. "A few other campers mentioned men like that, but we haven't been able to find them," and he hesitated, his expression darkening. "There's been a string of disappearances in the area, travelers who set up camp and were never seen again." When the officer asked where we'd camped, my stomach dropped. "By the crater," I said. He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. One group went missing from the same spot last month. We only found their car, blood in the back seat, nothing else. We never went back to Wolf Creek, but the memory of these faces, these cold, calculating eyes haunts me. They let us go that night. I don't know why, but I can feel it in my bones. It wasn't mercy. It was a warning. The Outback stretches forever. Endless plains of red dust, shimmering heat, and scrubby bushes that seem alive only because they sway in the wind. I'd always wanted to see it for myself, to feel the isolation, the silence. I thought it would be beautiful. I thought it would be peaceful. I was wrong. It started as a road trip, just me, my boyfriend Jake, and his sister Tara. We rented a 4-wheel drive and packed it full of supplies. Our plan was simple: drive from Alice Springs to the Gulf of Carpentaria, taking our time to explore the most remote parts of the country. It was the third night when things went wrong. We had set up camp near an old windmill, miles from the nearest town. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the Outback transformed. Shadows grew long, the air chilled, and the vast openness that had seemed liberating during the day now felt suffocating. As we sat around the fire, Jake started telling stories about people who had vanished in the Outback: backpackers, hikers, travelers. Some were accidents, dehydration, heat stroke, but others, the stories were darker. Groups who had gone missing without a trace. Campers whose sites were found abandoned, belongings untouched. Some say there are people out here, Jake said, his voice low, who've gone feral, living off the land, hiding from the law, watching anyone who comes too close to their territory. That's enough, Tara snapped, throwing a stick into the fire. It's just stories. Tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The night was too quiet, not even the crickets dared to make a sound. Later, as I lay in the tent, I heard it, a faint rustling outside. Jake? I whispered. Shh, he said, already awake beside me. His body was tense, listening. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by the soft crunch of footsteps. They circled the tent, slow and deliberate. An animal? Tara whispered from the other tent. No animal walks like that, Jake nodded. Then came the whispering, low, guttural murmurs just outside the thin nylon walls of our tent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give us away. Jake reached for the flashlight, but I grabbed his arm. No, I mouthed. The footsteps stopped for a moment. There was only silence. Then the whispering turned into laughter, quiet at first, then louder. It wasn't joyful or even mocking. It was broken, wrong, as if whoever was laughing didn't know how to do it properly. The fire outside crackled and shadows danced across the tent. I saw them, shapes, tall and hunched, their outlines flickering against the tent walls. One of them leaned closer, and I held my breath as a filthy, calloused hand pressed against the fabric, tracing the curve of my face. I wanted to scream, but Jake clammed his hand over my mouth. The whispers faded and the footsteps moved away. When we finally dared to look, the fire was out. The chairs were overturned and our supplies were scattered across the campsite, but they weren't gone. The tracks led in a wide circle around us, looping back to the edge of the scrub. They were toying with us, letting us know they could come back at any time. Pack up, Jake hissed. We threw everything into the car, not caring what we left behind. As we sped off into the night, the headlights caught movement. Figures slipping between the trees, their faces pale and hollow. We drove for hours, too terrified to stop. But the Outback doesn't care about your fear. It stretches on, and the darkness feels infinite. When the sun finally rose, we found ourselves on a narrow dirt road that wasn't on the map. The car was running low on fuel and every direction looked the same. Red earth and endless sky. Do you hear that? Tara asked suddenly. At first I didn't, then I did. The sound of an engine. Relief flooded through me. Someone else was out here. We flagged them down, waving our arms frantically. The truck that pulled up was ancient, its paint chipped and rusted. The man driving it had a face like old leather, his eyes hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. Car trouble? He asked, his voice thick with an accent I couldn't place. No, Jake hesitated. We need directions. The man grinned, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. Not many people out this way, he said. You're lucky I found you. There was something in his tone, something that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Thanks, Jake said quickly, pulling me back towards the car. We'll figure it out. The man didn't argue. He just sat there, watching us as we drove away. Half an hour later, the engine sputtered and died. We were stranded. Behind us, in the distance, a plume of dust rose on the horizon. Another vehicle. Do you think it's him? Tara asked, her voice shaking. Jake didn't answer. As the dust grew closer, I realized it wasn't just one car. There were two, maybe three. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. I don't remember running, but we did, into the endless scrub. the sound of engines roaring behind us. The last thing I saw before we disappeared into the bush was the first truck pulling up beside our abandoned car. The man stepped out, his wide-brim hat tilted against the sun, and he wasn't alone. There were others, climbing out of their vehicles. They didn't chase us, they didn't need to. They knew the Outback better than we ever could. Their eyes, dark, hollow, watching us with an unsettling patience, told me everything. They knew the land, the terrain, the way the sun would burn you alive if you didn't stay on the path. They didn't need to chase us because they knew we'd break long before they did. I don't know how long we ran, long enough for the sun to blister my skin, for my legs to give out, for my breath to come in desperate, ragged gasps. But no matter how much I pushed myself, no matter how hard I tried to outrun the horror of what was happening, the distance between us and them never seemed to grow. I couldn't hear the engines anymore, but I could hear them, footsteps, too light, too deliberate, echoing through the scrub, just on the edge of hearing, always just behind us. Then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was on the ground, the red dust of the Outback clinging to my skin. My mouth was dry, cracked, and my body ached like I'd been hit by a truck. Barely move, but I could hear Jake's voice, weak and hoarse, calling my name. Tara was shaking me, her voice frantic as she tried to help me sit up. We'd made it, we were alive, but we were far from safe. Jake and Tara had managed to find shelter in a narrow, shallow cave, hidden from view by the dense brush and boulders. I had no idea how they'd gotten there, but we weren't alone. The others, those men from the vehicles, hadn't followed us into the cave, but they were close, very close. I could feel it, their presence pressed against the air, suffocating like a bad dream I couldn't wake from. "Are they gone?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know," Jake said, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "We have to stay quiet, they're out there." We huddled together in the dark, listening to the sounds of the Outback around us, the wind, the distant calls of birds, the occasional crunch of dry grass or footsteps. But we knew it wasn't the wilderness making these sounds anymore. For what felt like hours, we lay in the dark, barely breathing, waiting for something, anything to change. I wanted to move, to run again. But my legs were like jelly, and every time I tried to stand, a wave of dizziness hit me hard. Then we heard it, a voice, low and gravelly, calling out in the distance just outside the cave. "I know you're in there," the voice said. "Come out and we'll make this easy for you." I froze. Tara let out a quiet sob. Jake put his hand over her mouth to silence her. The voice called again, more impatient this time. "There's no use hiding. You're out of water. You're out of food. You'll die out here if you don't come with us." The seconds dragged by like hours. The pressure in the air felt thick, like we were being watched by unseen eyes. But then, just as suddenly, the voice stopped. The footsteps faded. We stayed in the cave for what felt like an eternity, not daring to make a sound. When the sun dipped low on the horizon, we finally dared to move. Jake let us out cautiously, his eyes scanning the scrub in every direction. We had to move fast, no time to think. Our car, our only chance of escape, was miles away, but we didn't have a choice. We stumbled through the dark for hours, relying on the little energy we had left, following a barely there trail that Jake claimed he'd remembered from earlier. Every step felt like a risk, but there was no turning back. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the sky, we were at the outskirts of a small, rundown roadhouse, a place that barely showed up on the map. The lights were dim and the building looked deserted, but we ran toward it, frantic. We banged on the door and a man finally answered. He was older, with a weathered face and the look of someone who'd spent way too many years in the Outback. When he saw us, his eyes widened. "Jesus Christ, what the bloody hell is this?" he said, looking behind us. We didn't have time to explain. "Please, you've got to help us," I begged, trying to catch my breath. "There are people out there, they're chasing us, we don't know who they are." He didn't ask any more questions. He let us in, locked the door, and told us to sit tight. It wasn't until we finally got a chance to rest, to drink water and breathe again, that we learned what had happened. The police had been called to the area after the authorities started piecing together missing person reports and strange sightings in the region. Apparently, the people we'd encountered weren't just crazy. They were part of a notorious group that had been terrorizing campers for years. People who had learned how to survive off the land, that had turned their isolation into something far darker. The police arrived hours later and searched the area. They found our abandoned car, but the vehicles that had been chasing us were gone, just like the people. But what haunted me the most was what the roadhouse owner said as we left. "Be careful out there," he warned. "There's a reason people don't go off the beaten path in these parts anymore." I'll never know if these people we ran from were ever caught. I'll never forget the way they watched us, the way they knew we were never getting out without their permission. I haven't been back to the Outback since, and I don't think I ever will.